Astral is not far away, but we still have a few formats or a few tournaments of Brilliant Stars left. So we thought we'd do a bit of an updated tier list. We like to try and do these sort of midway through the block as well, as we're going into the block. To be fair, usually we start with looking at the old one. I haven't looked at the old one recently. How was it, Joe? Just because I don't have it open.
Do you want to have a look?
I can see if I can find it quickly.
I can send you a link if you can't find it.
Let's have a
So our last one was in Feb.
Okay, yeah, I think I've got it.
And obviously, at the start of a thing, there's always more decks on there naturally. Oh, that's the advert.
Sorry, yeah, that was Peloton.
Pelting my ears.
Peloton pelting my ears.
But I think we did a pretty good job from what I'm looking at now, honestly.
Oh, Joe, there's 2 ads on this video. Why we need to get rid of the ads? Don't
get more ads. Yes.
Get them gone.
Give the people what they want. Yes. More ads.
Right,
please.
Here we are. We now have a tier list. Let me pause this and pop it on stream quickly. So, what do we have? We have Mew at the top, which I think at the time was definitely correct. Mew, I think, has dropped a bit. We'll chat about that in a minute. But so one thing I'm noticing is a severe lack of Arc Intel.
Yeah, well, we weren't testing much.
Yeah, I was going to say I feel like I remember us not respecting it, but not genuinely just testing it during that tabletop phase and not really liking it. So committing to some of the other sort of dark stuff, which I don't think was incorrect, but it turns out
it's one of those things where like Arceus's win con against Mew, at least Water Arceus, is Marnie Path Prey, and that's just like a feeling that we didn't want to have. So we were trying things like Mew engines and Bat engines, basically faster engines. Yeah. Let's not forget this is the format that introduced Luminion. So we were trying like 2 pricey fast engines. I remember our initial arc played Luminion, Crobat, and Eldegoss, like one of each of them. So we were trying sort of lower to the ground arcs. And interestingly, Mew has like got in favor slowly, but we were massively on Mew engines of arc.
Yeah.
Early on, but yeah, obviously Intellion ended up being worthwhile, and like apparently Marnie Path is a good enough win condition, and obviously Arc Intel with Bird package. You see that we have a ton of Baby Bird like on all sorts of different partners, so we knew that Baby Bird was like cracked.
Yeah,
we just didn't put it with Intel.
The rest of our tier 1 feels pretty solid. The Arc Dark stuff is kind of not really shaped out, and I guess also pure single strike was pretty quickly overshadowed by Gengar, just because Gengar was able to batter Mew in those first few weeks. But yeah, Mali did really well at the first couple of tournaments. Suicune Ludi did its classic thing where no one plays it, then someone does really well with it, then no one plays it for a bit, and so I still think positioning wise it was a pretty spot on call. I think Finn did very well with the deck, but I think it was a very good deck to be playing, so I think we were pretty spot on with that. Ice Rider, I guess, flopped a bit. I feel like it's starting to creep back into the meta and creep back into conversations. It still feels like it's so weird. It's been like 3 or 4 sets now where it's just felt like it's been a piece off, and then we've seen the piece like Leon or Choice Belt or whatever, and it's still not there. And then we saw Hawlucha, and it turns out Hawlucha isn't what it needs. Maybe it needs Greninja, and it always felt like it's this deck that's just one piece away.
And the exact list that we put into tier 1, that was when I was experimenting a ton with new Cincino engine, because we had the new Mincino, right? So I was trying a really wacky, like turbo-y aggro list of Suicune, where it just like slammed turn 1 Melanie. I don't know why I stopped testing that. I actually thought that was pretty strong. But yeah, I mean, Single Strike fell off, obviously.
Yeah.
We
Well,
only, like, I guess only putting one Arceus in tier 1 was our biggest mistake.
Yeah.
The fact that it's like, this is cracked. We thought basically one would rise, but it turns out that it's so versatile that, like, it basically dominates the top tier just on its own in different
the other thing
flavors.
that's worth mentioning though is we are only 2 people, and you guys saw that we're talking about 9 Arceus decks right now, but even with all the time in the world, we probably couldn't have come up with 9 different Arceus variants that we're looking at today. You can see that there's 6. I think there was 6 or 5, 6 that we talked about on this this list here. Admittedly, 3 or 4 of them are pretty much non-existent now.
This was also 3 weeks before release of the set.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm just saying. I feel like we still get a bit.
I think
of
there's a
credit.
lot we got spot on as well. Like even just saying the Urshi Molt. Obviously, we tried it with Big Molt first, but we had Baby Molt in there as well. Our initial list was Mew and Octillery, so it was basically just us saying Intel.
I mean,
it's weird that we were questioning Intel because it was carrying the format, but we just wanted speed.
Well, the other thing that's worth remembering, admittedly, they still played Intel, obviously, but Asaya Bradner and Rahul and the guys that did well at EUIC were still playing basically our deck just with an Intellion engine, which feels like very big, but also it means that we were kind of on the right lines with the speed, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, the Muse.
Yeah. Arc Duraludon has kind of fallen off and started to creep back in, but again, we thought it was pretty solid early on, and it did end up winning
did very
a 1K.
well early meta as well.
It was like second or third most converting points deck along with Gengar, because basically, at least in the early stages of the format, both of those decks just battered Mew, and everyone was repping Mew. Obviously, the meta's evolved in such a way that both of them are a lot weaker now, but they were really, really strong calls early, and again, I feel like we got that right. And I feel like our 1.5 Arceus with Zapdos, we kind of had, again, probably not with Intellion, but we kind of had an Ian Robb style idea in mind in terms of just Arceus plus.
Our initial toolbox all played Hooper V as well. I don't know if you remember this, Jack, but we, like, all of our initial builds were still playing that Hooper.
Yeah. There was a point. There was a point at which we were playing 2-2 Moltres,
2 of each. Correct.
Yeah. I think, like, basically everything from like tier 2 down, you will see when we talk about the new tier list, was written off by like 1 or 2 decks. So maybe we naturally overrated stuff there, but it always happens. But in general, I think honestly our tier 1 and 1.5, there's nothing like too catastrophic.
No, I think it's pretty good. I liked the idea of I remember us being super high on a Cincino engine of Dark with Zapdos.
Yeah.
Because the Surfetch deck had like just started doing well online, and we were like, oh, we can cut the Surfetch and make it so much smoother. We put a lot of time into that.
Yeah. That was one of our. I think that was probably the deck we put the most time into pre-set coming out, and then basically when Natalie won with Mew, I think basically the majority of our testing group just went, well, why aren't we playing Mew?
Yeah.
Obviously, a couple of us didn't. You played Rapid Mallet, and a couple of us played Arceus. But I think that whole tournament, despite it being smaller than the average regionals, it just showed how dominant Mew was. That we just kind of stopped thinking about it, trying to get fancy with the meta, and just started drawing 16 cards a turn and realizing it was cracked.
Yeah. I want to look at our most recent top 10 as well, actually. Was it most recent or 2 months ago? We did it for
EUSC, right?
So this was day of release. I did a top 10. Did I have a Arceus with Intellion?
I feel like you did.
So I had like an Ian Robb bird box. No, we just did that. Yeah, it was just a Mew engine. I swear I did 2 deck lists though. Weird. Anyway. Yeah, I think even the top 10 was like a better. Obviously, that's later on in the meta, and that's when we did have that Zapdos Moltres Cincino deck like number 5.
What date is that from?
That was 25th of Feb, literally day of release.
Okay, so yeah, and I think this is testament to testing in general. You can see that even two, like there's a 2 weeks difference between, or 3 weeks difference between those two. So we did a really, really early tier list, to be honest. But I remember we started Brilliant Stars testing like second week of January or something crazy. But yeah, you can.
That top 10 actually holds up now, more or less.
Like, I was gonna say, I feel like you can see that we followed the meta pretty well.
That's so cracked that I had Hooper in there as well at the time. Galaxy brain.
Anyway, though, it's all well and good saying how great we were back then, but let's do it again, Joe. Let's try and match our last top 10s or tier list success with another one.
The accuracy, yeah.
This time, I think we have a bit of a harder job because there's so many Arceus variants that have so little between them. It's difficult, but regardless, let's see what we can do.
Yeah, I think for a developed tier list like this as well, we can talk about key includes that we think are correct right now, or like going into New Jersey, Lille, Perth, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So I think that's more or less people know where to place these, I would say. Or like they're not going to deviate too much from where we're at, but we should talk about key matchups that make us put them higher than other builds, especially for Arceus.
I think the other big thing to know,
key includes.
I think the other big thing to note is you can see here we've just gone down to 2.5, so basically we've written off everything like tier 3 and S, which is why this is going to seem way more condensed. But that's because basically if you're not playing any of these decks, what are you doing? And realistically, like if you're not playing at least tier 2, maybe even tier 1.5, you're naturally setting yourself up for a much harder day, in my opinion at least. So yeah. Let's crack on with some of these Arceus variants though. I'm going to, I guess, kick things off with... someone mentioned Beedrill in the chat, so let's crack on with Intel Bees. Obviously, this did pretty well last weekend now? The weekend before in Indy. Ending up coming second, and I think everyone who played the list that those guys built ended up converting, which is pretty good. Honestly, feels like a pretty strong response to the EUIC metagame. Beedrill definitely proved itself in a build that wasn't Intellion based, that really relied on starbirthing for mustard, that kind of thing. So when you don't have to starbirth for mustard, it's pretty cool. Obviously, the list has a lot less space when you're playing the Intellion stuff, so you can't play some of these other attackers, but we've seen how strong of an archetype of a shell Arceus Intellion is. It's basically not really a control deck, but it's just an attrition deck. It really just grinds out the game. You have Power Pad Sharon's Care, sometimes double Sharon's Care. You've got one prizes that make things annoying, things like Dunsparce and Manaphy, and then sometimes recovery for them as well in certain builds. So we knew the shell, or it's obvious that the shell of Arc Intel is very, very strong. So deviating away from that, maybe losing some percentage points in terms of consistency, but adding in the bomb that is Beedrill every now and again is pretty impressive. Honestly, I really, really like the archetype. I still think it's definitely up there, and I think it feels like it's very much established as one of the best Arceus variants at the moment.
Yeah, it's like the Beedrill is hugely beneficial into Mew. If you can get it early enough in Mirror, it can be huge as an instant response on their first arc, which I think is massive as well.
Yeah.
Like it denies early Sharoning, and it means they put on the following turn another arc V down in a lot of instances, or denies them a second arc V coming into play, because then they can get just bossed the following turn, and then you can basically deny Sharon the entire game if you get the aggro B against them, which I think is just crazy. Very good into Mew, insane against Whimsicott. So Beedrill has like a good amount of value, I think, in the game. Right now. Let's talk about, I guess, the sort of bread and butter Arc Intel, which is the water build.
Yeah.
We're gonna bump this down to 1.5. It's basically the no thrills deck, especially if you look at the most recent list from Indy, Pablo's list. He played this EUIC as well, and just tries to play the game, man. It's pretty simple. It's just saying that Arceus is so crazy. The Intel engine gets you, like, throughout the mid and late games pretty well sorted, that you're just sort of keeping things honest. I personally don't like only having the Marnie path game plan into Mew. I feel like there are stronger Arceus decks into the Mew matchup, which is why we kind of like it at 1.5. Because you don't have that like type coverage to lean into. You just have the sort of hand disruption and hoping that you're chunky enough that they have to have massive like tablet combo turns to rail you, and if not, you can sort of take control of the game. So putting it that little bit lower, but you have a lot of tricks, and you've got obviously water energy inherently. Actually going to like 7 water I think is super interesting now as well, because it helps out against Whimsicott and helps out against Beedrill, where sometimes you can get a turn attach of water and then you can go Melanie turn attach basic water. I think that's actually like really big going ahead. So having that option compared to some of the other Arceus decks makes you pretty good into Beedrill, which is nice. If you want to do the Ian Rob thing and add in Metacham as well, I think you can do some funky plays, because as we saw, Ian's list doesn't have a lot to enable the Metacham. It even only plays like 2 nets, and like a normal Arc Intel water plays like 3. So I think enabling a Metacham in this sort of list could be super interesting as well. That's really where I'm at with the water build, but I really like its simplicity, and if you just want to get gaming, I think it's still safe, but your Mew matchup could be better, I think.
Yeah, in my mind, it really feels like the Beedrill list and also the Dark list, which we'll chat about in a minute. Both of those sacrifice a bit of consistency because you're adding in this extra package, whichever the package may be. So the like it feels like the straight build wins in terms of consistency, but then again, like you say, it probably has the weakest answer in terms of the answers that all of these Arc Intel decks have into Mew, which is still pretty scary, because even though Mew is definitely on the decline, especially from the start of the format, but even now it feels like it's probably at the lowest point it's been in a couple of months, to be honest. It's still going to be 2-3 of your rounds. It's still very, very popular. It's still very, very good. So just having the Marnie Path strat is kind of sketch, I think. What else do we have? Let's go for another Arc build just to start whittling them down.
I think it's good to actually talk about them in the bunch. I know we're covering a lot of Arc, but because we're comparing them against each other, it makes sense, right?
Yeah. I think I'm going to go with Ian Rob's list, but we're going to put in sort of that tier 1.5 as well. Attacked by a lawnmower, says Sand. That is rude. We're going to put it in that 1.5 as well. Again, I think it serves a less consistent purpose than some of these other Arc decks, especially because the part of the Arceus deck that you trim is the Arceus, and arguably Starbirth is the bit that stitches it all together. But type cover, like Arceus plus type coverage, has basically been on everyone's radar ever since the card was printed, because it's just that's exactly the kind of deck that Arceus lends itself to. Like you mentioned, it's even got space for some of these kind of crazier cards like Metacham and stuff. Whether they're correct or not is more so, I guess, up to the player, but having so many options, it really feels like it's the Arceus counterbox deck can work. Again, I feel like the consistency here and there hurts it a bit, just because instead of cutting into something like the Intellion line, you are having to cut into the 2 prize or cut into the Arceus line, and just having a core that is 2 prize based rather than 1 prize based, or more 2 prizes than some of these other Arceus decks, I think will catch you with your back against the wall every now and again, just because basically Arceus and Mew always want to be trading into 2 prizes anyway, so the 2 prizes you're using have to be good and have to not just keep up with the race, but sometimes win on tempo as well, just to still not lose a race anyway. But that being said, it's the second time this kind of list has done well, and I think that it pays dividends to the list, because it's evident that there really is something there. I really like it. I think I would be playing something like it if I was attending Lille this weekend, because it has a lot of options, but it still has a pretty strong core, which is just really appealing in my opinion.
Yeah, I think so. It's weird though. Like I don't know how Zapdos is still getting like the value that Ian seems to be getting out of it. It kind of astonishes me. Like, surely everyone played Dunsparce at the tournament and won't just be throwing down Vs like crazy. Like, most of the Arc decks now have like 2 Arc down at any point, and that's really it. Like, I don't know how Zapdos is still getting that much value. But it's Basically just a more aggressive build of a Dark Arc anyway with Intel. So it's like in that midway point where maybe you can strip away a few pieces, because that's my main concern is like the consistency of this deck compared to some of the others.
Yeah.
Puts me off. But it's an options toolbox. It's basically the exact opposite of why we put a straight water list in tier 1.5. It's like one doesn't have enough answers, one has too many perhaps, and you need to just narrow in on beating a couple key matchups. But yeah.
Which is exactly what Beedrill does.
Yeah, basically. Let's just take Mew off the table.
Yeah.
I think we think it's dethroned from tier S and is just in that tier 1 category. I think it's pretty clear that if you lump Arceus together as a whole, it's accumulated more points than Mew. I think more top cuts and all that other stuff. So Mew is certainly still respected, and most of the other top decks in tier 1 and 1.5 have a game plan into Mew, some stronger than others. And it's still going to be a huge threat and will be a big presence. And probably, if you point to the most popular individual deck in a room, it's probably this, because there's so many different ways to play Arc Intel. Essentially, it's the flavor of energy that changes for Arc Intel. But Mew could still easily be like 10-15% of the field in the first day of the competition. We've just seen a catcher build pop up as well, which is super scary. I haven't actually spoken to Jack much about the catcher build. I mean, it terrifies me as someone wanting to play Mew as well as like wanting to play any other deck, because if you're not playing catches yourself in a mirror, that can be really bad, and it capitalizes on so many weak Arceus board states. And a lot of these builds of Arceus are relying on situations like they've gone first and got 2-1 prizes out, so they can only sack that 1 prize and they just put 1 arc down, or even putting 2 arc down mean that you're like more vulnerable to late game echoing horn plays. So just the fact that catcher is an element in the room now, like just because there's that bit of worry, you have to play your opening hands even more carefully, and like you need even better openers to beat insane high roll hands of the echo plus catcher heads. So I think that's just a huge added fear factor for the meta. I probably still wouldn't play catchers because the cuts that Andrew and Michael had to make in their list was like just too many consistency cards for me, like too many Rotom Phones and stuff. But wholly, it changes the dynamic of playing against a Mew player, that's for sure. You have to play like a real pansy now.
Yeah, I mean,
so that's extremely dangerous.
It's still, in my opinion, it's still the most aggressive deck in the format, and again, as a raw 60, the strongest deck in the format. I agree with you that it's now, I'm pretty sure, probably like definitely mid tier 1, nowhere near tier S, and I don't even think I think it's on the bottom half of tier 1, just because I think your average tournament, there's way more of an awareness for Mew now, but raw 60 cards, the card is still, or the deck is still absolutely insane. It's still dominating in terms of, if like, even if it's not converting to top 8, it's still, I would say, I haven't looked at the numbers, but I would still say it's probably split up. When you split up the Arceus variants, it's not just a bit further ahead, it's still probably almost all like head and shoulders further ahead.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So,
I'm pretty sure it is. I was just going to ask you, because I know you played this in Bilbao just 2 weeks ago, right?
Yeah.
Are you still, would you be playing Marnie and would you be playing 4th 1 Prizer? You played both, right, I think?
Yeah, so I played an Ice Cube and a Marnie. Didn't really feel like I got the value out of Marnie. Didn't really feel like I got the value out of Ice Cube until like the last round, to be fair. But I think I'd still play 3rd 1 Prizer. I don't know whether it would be Ice Cube or 3rd Meloetta. It probably still would be Ice Cube, because I think 3rd Meloetta has pretty diminishing returns.
And my other question is, if you finish your point on that, but my other question would be, how many basic Psychic are you feeling right now because of Whim's threat, but also Beedrill threat, right?
Yeah. I probably wouldn't. It seems like Marnie has become standard from the lists I've been seeing lately, which makes me not want to play it, because I feel like everyone else is dealing with the dark combo decks for me. And Marnie, I still think, is a pretty bad card in the deck. It was like a knee-jerk reaction to basically the whole meta shifting to Intellion plus Moltres. So I think I wouldn't find a space for Marnie, which is great because it means I get to play like Force Switch Out or whatever a game that I ended up cutting, which is fine. Basic energy count, I actually would go back up to 2. because I
2 and
think
1 DTE, right?
yeah, I think Beedrill is enough of a threat now that I think even for Bilbao and that weekend, Beedrill was still fairly low key, but it only like it breaking through to. I mean, it breaking through to second place almost didn't matter too much because the hype was already there. But it's not like unlike the Urshifu decks, which were difficult to play and you had to really set up a board state that you could very easily still lose with as the Urshifu deck, even though you're playing this like this combo. Even though you're playing the like Arceuses and 2 prizes and stuff like that, it's not difficult to see that mustarding out a Beedrill takes 3 prizes here and puts them in a really bad spot. Like, no matter how many 2 prizes you have down, because, again, it forces... Well, basically, they can't do it again, because otherwise they lose. So I think opening up the deck to not have to immediately lose to a Beedrill definitely hurts in terms of mirror, because DT is huge for the mirror, for sure. But I think from what I've seen of playing Beedrill and playing Mew against Beedrill, whilst they really, really love to see a Mew with any kind of special energy, the deck kind of folds to a Mew with 2 psychics. There's just nothing they can do about it. So
they're obviously not playing Path. They're not playing any defense outside of the B, right? Yeah.
So I think just out of respect for Beedrill, I don't know whether I'd cut. I don't know whether I'd cut to 1 DTE or whether I'd try an 8 energy build. I know a couple of us have tried 8 energy, and I'm still not convinced on it. But DT is so good, it pains me.
I think Bert played 8 for EUIC, right? He played 2 and 2.
He did, and he said he would do it again if he was going to Bilbao. Again, I'm pretty sure the second Psyche is very justified. It's just whether that second DTE is justified. But yeah, either way, I'm pretty sure I'd at least be playing second Psychic. Honestly, probably. Maybe even from my Bilbao list, it'd just be cutting the Marley and putting second Psychic in or something like that. I'd probably want to play a full Crystal at that point as well. But
yeah, that sounds reasonable.
But yeah, it like we're still in the same situation with Mew, in my opinion, where we've had 55 cards basically for like 6 months now. Well, 3 months, I guess, because DT and Choice Belt and Ultra Ball changed things so much. But we've had 55 cards basically since like week 2 of January. And it's always been this exact debate, basically around the energy and around the consistency cards like phones and crams and switching ups, this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
But yeah, I still think it's super solid.
Agree.
What do I want to go for next? I guess let's chat. In fact, let me just add the last Arceus Intellion build to the board. We still think this is tier 1. In fact, I'm going to do this.
You haven't.
Arc Intel with a dark package, I think, is a very, very appealing concept. I think when we were talking about the different Arceus Intellion builds and saying you cut consistency for matchup spread or this, that, the other, blah, blah, blah. I think these 2 Arceus Intellion decks in tier 1 are the perfect blend of cutting some consistency for some matchup spread, because I think both of the answers packages that you add in are worth the space that you donate to them. I still think I prefer the dark stuff to the Beedrill, just because it's not necessarily less awkward to play, but Mustard at the end of the day is still a pretty bad card. And Moltres, Beedrill's not ever dead, but Moltres is never dead. After turn 2, Moltres is never dead. It's at least keeping tempo. It's a lot of resources, but even so, it's still pretty strong, I think. So I think I very marginally prefer the dark build over the Beedrill build, but honestly, I think these decks are pretty interchangeable. I think Arceus Intellion has the most control over their own deck out of any deck we have in the format right now. They can choose exactly what they want to do and when they want to do it for the most part, outside of crazy Arceus hands that happen turn 1 the majority of the time, in my opinion, but people make it work, which is great. So you can do things like build dark combos, build a Beedrill combo, this, that, and the other. And I think the tempo that they give is so strong, along with the natural tempo of having a 280, sometimes 310 HP 2-prize Pokemon that's also setting up another Pokemon is just absolutely like bonkers. So yeah, I'm pretty happy. If we're lumping stuff together, I'm pretty sure they also probably have more points over the past like 2 or 3 tournaments than Mew, and probably some of the other decks combined, because they've just really like Arkintel. Basically, in the latest, it's not been posted yet, but in the latest CCG pie chart for Indy as well, Arkintel had its own section. It was that big, separate from all of the other Arc variants. So yeah, Arkintel is just, it feels like a deck on its own, and you just add a bit of whatever you want in. And I think this is the best. Well, these two definitely, but ever so slightly more so the Dark build is the best way to play right now.
Yeah, I don't know if it's just a European thing as well, but I think just like the fact that this gets to play Hooper is such a load off my mind, just to have a better game into Urshi as well, because it didn't really show up in Indy, and it's one of those things where in European events, if 5 of the best players out of like a room of 300 people, it's quite different from 5 of the best players in a room of 1,000 people playing Urshifu, because it means that as you progress through the day, you actually need to answer Urshifu, which isn't like always the case for some of the other Arc builds. They can get away with just like Pokemon Recovery, Dunsparce, Manaphy, whereas this one is like playing the Hooper V almost always. Yeah. So that's kind of important, I think.
Sure.
Let's talk about I guess another regional winner, the Arceus Lucario Hooper, seeing as though we're on the subject. We're gonna drop this into tier 2. First thing to say is we're munching through lots of Arceus builds, just like here straight away, and any deck that isn't playing an Intel engine, I think, is pretty unfavored in the Arc Mirror. I know the coin flip is still massive in Arc Mirror, just because that turn 2 power spike is just so much more important than anything else in terms of like what you're playing or whatever. But less access to Sharon's Care when you want it is quite bad, I think, in Mirror. It's very rare that this deck, at least from my experience, is able to save a V-Star attack for Lucario rather than have to Star Buff yourself. If that does come off, like, yes, Lucario's V-Star attack is like insane for getting a one-shot on the first guy, and very hard for them to play around. Like, even under Dunsparce, you're getting that one-shot pretty often. But I think you're normally Star Birthing anyway, so it just becomes kind of like a fighting dude that keeps a Dunsparce in play for whatever reason. And the list we saw from Brazil didn't even play like Avi or anything to try and disrupt a board, like where they have to keep a Dunsparce and a backup attacker in play, leave them with only like one Drizzle or something. That just wasn't a factor, and I think maybe it could be a factor in the deck, but I still feel like this is trying to do like a lot of things anyway. Like the Lucario for me just never really felt like it was doing what I wanted it to in the deck. I like the Hooper, I like the mini Crobat package. It's still sketchy into me, but you have Path Marnie and a Dark package, so you're kind of doing a couple of the higher tier Arceus decks game plans wrapped into one deck, which is something. The main benefit, I think, of this engine compared to Intel is that you just have safer turn 1s, and maybe with more catcher builds of Mew, that's going to be a higher value thing to look at. But regardless, if they're still hitting like catcher heads, even if you have 2 Arceus down, they're still taking 2 prizes turn 1, and that's like back-breaking already. So I'm not too sure, but yeah, sketchy because it's not playing Intel, so you can't cherry-pick Sharon. You're hoping to just beat stick stuff, and that's kind of what the Ian Robb list can do anyway, and I think probably like just as good, if not better.
Yeah, I was going to make that exact comparison. It feels like these are 2 Arceus decks that try to be counter-boxy, but one of them gets to play Intellion, well, one of them plays Intellion and one of them doesn't. There will definitely be situations where the barrel is getting you more than what an Intellion could have, but like realistically, across 100 games, you've got to assume the Intellion build is far more consistent in the majority of situations. So not only for getting those crazy high roll turns, but also just for getting into the game. Like you have to draw well in the first couple of turns. You have to draw way better in the first couple of turns with a build like this compared to an Intellion engine when Drizzards can just be picking up pieces for you. So yeah. What do I want to talk about next? Let's talk about the one prize sort of
one of your favorites.
Dark Arceus, well, not Dark Arceus, Dark Intellion kind of things. A deck that I played at EUIC along with a couple of other people from CCG, and then Stefan Ivanov and a few others also picked it up for Bilbao and did okay with it. It's a deck that I actually thought was way higher in tier 1.5 when I played it back at EUIC. I now think it's dropped. You'll see it's still fairly high in 1.5, but when we filter this out, it's going to be more towards the end of 1.5. The whole theory behind the deck was basically, at the time, Rapid Mally was still very, very popular. We were just coming off the back of Liverpool, and there'd basically been no events since. There was one event in LATAM, and that was it. So Rapid Mally, at least in EU, was still very, very popular. That and Rapid Strike Urshifu feels like they really haven't converted over across the pond, but over here they were very, very popular. And for us, we felt like we had a very strong game plan against Mew, a very strong game plan against Rapid Mally. Luke's in Helen, thanks so much for the raid. And a game plan against Arceus, albeit not the strongest of game plans, but at least at the time, there was basically no chat about the deck really at all. So we felt like we could win a strong game 1 going into an Arceus matchup, and being naturally a fairly slow one prize deck, it probably wouldn't be going to 3 games a lot of the time. So we thought the deck was really, really strong. I think now, just because Arceus has turned into such a dominant force, basically off the back of the UIC and then Indie, I think there's just way too much Arceus to feel super comfortable about it now. It's really interesting that basically all the way through EUIC and Bilbao, when I was watching people play this game, or play this deck, against Arceus's, their Zapdoses were getting way more value than mine ever was, which is kind of upsetting. Because essentially that's all the deck had going for it. It was Zapdos to keep tempo and then try and win a late game trade with basically baby molts.
Yeah.
But that being said, I still think it has a very strong Mew. I still think it has a very strong... In fact, I think it's got very strong matchups into basically most of the fringe decks, because it was really good at crushing early Intellion engines with Rowlet. It was really good at jumping the prize trade against things like Mally and other one prize decks. It kind of struggled with other VMAXs, but VMAXs feel like they've basically disappeared from the format bar 1 or 2. And with Manaphy plus Cape plus Recovery, we felt like we had a fairly strong game plan going into Urshi as well. So I think the positioning for the deck was very strong. Now I think there's too much Arceus for it to feel like a super comfortable play for me, but there's enough other non-Arceus decks in the format that it's probably still a fairly reliable play in terms of getting you enough wins for points. There's still a lot of stuff going around, and again, you still have all of the usual stuff that you had when we were playing the deck with Zapdos and Rowlet, and then Baby Molt for late game against Arceus. So it's not like the game plan hasn't changed at all. It's just people are aware of the game plan now. Whether they respect it, whether they have tested against it, is a completely different question. But yeah, it still feels like a fairly solidly positioned deck. I cannot get past the tournament that was a UIC for me, where basically I drew past for like 5 rounds in a row, which was super sad, because I think compared to the list that were doing well in Bilbao, we respected the deck way more than that and played like 4 or 5 better starters than some of these other lists that have been going around. So it's just a bad beat with this may have tainted my view a little bit, but I'm not too proud to say the deck is still definitely up there in terms of viability, I think. And just being, for the most part, except against exactly Arceus, sometimes being a one prize deck actually gives you so much time in this format, especially when the other decks that you have time against are all multi prizes. You actually can basically do nothing for like the first 4 turns of the game, happily go down a few prizes and still have win cons available to you. So yeah, really, really strong deck. I think you need to not run poorly, maybe a little bit less so, maybe a little bit more so than some of these other decks, but if you run like half decent with the deck, it really feels like it can compete for sure.
Yeah, it feels like its main benefit is you're much more in control of your prize race than the Arceus builds of this approach, because you're more Puritan one prize, so you have that extra bit of time, but you never have that Starbirth power spike available. So it's like that's the only real trade-off. You need a little bit more in your early game of like more Drizzles need to be in hand in those openings to piece together responses.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Arc Barrel Crobat, I guess. It's very similar to what we were saying about Lucario, but we're going to talk about basically like the Corviknights, I guess like the pure dark with like just Crobat, Moltres, Hooper, those sorts of like other Arc Barrel engine type things. It's the same bugbear of like you don't play Sharons, which is very bad in most mirror situations. You have a slightly better like opening turn into most of these other matchups, so you punish the Arc Mirror by like going first and really just not missing a beat here and there, but you're still often not playing like anything outside of just Raihan for Boost Excel, and I guess you can play E-Switch, and I probably would now because of like Whimsicott and stuff, but you're just still mostly just all in on this Arc and play like 3 Prizer as well, so you oftentimes give your opponent an easier map than the Arc Intel, because Arc Intel normally plays a 2-on-1 prize game way better than a big barrel engine, so same issues really with Lucario, just I mostly went in on Lucario V-Star, but the same can be said for like the Corviknights and stuff. Obviously Corviknight has some benefits, it's like exceptional into like Whimsicott and stuff like that, but I don't think that's like a big enough threat to try and play an Arc Bib Bat. I just think it's far worse than an Intel build.
Yeah. Let's stick something in tier 2.5. I'm going to move Gengar in there, partly because I think the deck is hot garbage, but partly because I think the meta is just way worse for it now. At the start of the meta, it was actually very, very strong. It had the best Mew matchup, and even in bad beats, it still had it had so many answers for Mew. It had like bulky dark Pokemon that required very little setup, and also Path off the back of that. So there was just so many angles you would like bullying Mew with. It was insane. Now I think the deck is pretty much folded all the way down to 2.5. I think there's so many decks in the meta that actually just don't mind your opponent turning over a Gengar. There's nothing particularly special about its attacks, in my opinion. It feels like you're trading with Arceus pretty evenly, but they're giving up 1 less prize and can heal. They also have plenty of 1 prizes to race you with in the late game. They've got Beedrills to race you with. All of the Urshifu stuff I feel like is pretty strong against you because you're really struggling to respond to them, whilst they have huge tempo over you with a 1 energy attack that can realistically do a bomb load of damage. And basically everything in like tier 1.5 as well. Nothing screams at me that feels particularly strong. It was just so good at the time at bullying Mew, and Mew was so popular that it kind of pushed it all the way up to like 1.5. But now I really am struggling to see a reason to pick up Gengar outside of, a situation where like more smaller tournaments where the meta is purely Mew. It feels like for these bigger tournaments, you're going to see way too many more awkward matchups that an already inconsistent deck then has to deal with. You could get over the inconsistencies when you were just bullying Mew and battering Mew so hard because it didn't matter if you were being inconsistent. You just needed a Gengar with 2 energy, and they basically just folded. But yeah, now it's just too much in the way in the meta, I think.
There's Beedrills, there's Zapdoses, there's Urshis everywhere. That's all horrific. Baby, like, just having a 1 prize game plan and yawning at them until the Moltres is really good is a strat as well. So there's a lot of things that just have gone in the wrong direction for Gengar. I guess the same can be said for Jolteon. Let's put that alongside Gengar as like the sort of relics that sort of tried to hold on in the format, but really couldn't. There's obviously far too much Mana Fee. Urshifu put Mana Fee on the map. It's a big struggle for Jolteon, and of course there's Urshifu also hitting Jolteon itself. There's Zapdos can come in. Beedrill is often very effective against Jolteon as well. So these are all issues. It's had a paper-thin Mew matchup in the first place. Got worse than it did in the previous format because of Choice Belt. And now I still feel like 3 to 4 stadiums is staple in Mew. That much like isn't changing, even though like Path is mostly just like in Whimsicott and Water Arc now. There is less overall Path, but I still feel like Mew is rigidly sticking to like 3 stadium as their minimum. So the sort of Path cheese is just pretty weak, and it's super slow into Arceus that can just share and bounce against you, and it's kind of come unstuck there. Yeah.
A deck that we were going to put in 2.5, but I'm going to quickly change it to 2, is Arc Duraludon. Just
crazy.
Right at the end of tier 2. I was thinking about this. We were talking about this before, and we basically said like tier 2.5. It feels like there's not much reason to play these decks. Sure. I think that's not quite the case with Arc Duraludon. Arc Duraludon can definitely cheese games a little bit more than some of these other decks. It's not Path cheese, which is counterable. It's sometimes setting up a Duraludon and genuinely there are no answers to it. So I think it gains a couple of percentage points there. admittedly, I still think the deck is pretty weak. It feels like there's very little counterplay with the deck. It was very good in the early format, just because people still weren't accustomed to the list. Plus, also they weren't playing things like Horn and stuff. I think Horn naturally has gone down in Mew over the past few weeks, but I still personally see it as pretty much staple, just because it's such a game changer against Arc anyway, that having the bonus benefit of not immediately scooping to a Duraludon that draws well is really nice. I ended up playing 2 in Bilbao, so people just definitely pick up and play the deck. You'll definitely see 1 or 2 in, I would argue, probably pretty much every day 2 from now until the end of the format, just because it's respected enough, but it's not a high converting. It really feels like matchup roulette, and even in the matchups you want to be hitting, it feels like they are aware of the deck now. But there will be people that disrespect it, and unlike Path, which is kind of countered by the meta naturally, by people playing stadiums anyway, people sometimes just can't do anything against a Duraludon just because of its ability. So I think it's slightly better than 2.5, but only bottom of 2.
I'll give you that. Let's talk about Whimsy. We're going to pop Whimsy into that mid area of 1.5. It's had some big breakouts. Obviously, getting second at EOIC, then first in Bilbao, and also got a top 16 in Indy, which, a lot of the time you sort of shrug off a top 16, but in a 1,000 player tournament, top 16 is still incredible. Some different builds coming out as well. Alessandro and Riley played very, very vastly different lists. We've seen a Zacian V coming in for some early game protection and sort of acceleration, so you don't just lose to aggressive bossing, which is kind of interesting. And there's the Shadow Rider. I think it's just trying to give you extra protection against early Trinity charges / Nova, and early just Meloetta pressure, which is interesting as well. So yeah, some new avenues for the Whimsicott, I guess, to explore. Sort of list brought to us by Frank. I've honestly not touched much Whimsicott. It's just not a deck that I enjoy playing at all. Just really doesn't suit my personal play style, because it feels like your opening turns are fragile and you really are relying on hitting heads in the opening stages, specifically against some Arceus builds and stuff like that, to actually get into the game. But your foot can get in the door in basically most matchups, and you have some cool players with Fluffball Star and whatnot. So I feel like you're playing either EXP shares or Raihan's or a bit of both. I do like adding in the fish as well, so you can just get that Raihan on the right turn, because I think that's a big headache for, if ever your Trick Wind lock is broken in some matchups, especially against Mew, you're just going to lose in an instant. So just make sure you have access to that Raihan when you need it, I think, is one of the only things I'd say is an important card to play in the deck. But yeah, the Beedrill is a huge worry, I guess, now that it's a known quantity and obviously batters Whims, and I don't think there's a way that you can play around that outside of passing into them and using a Zacian to just keep attaching basic energies. But the deck only plays 4 to 5 maximum basic energy anyway. So there's only for so long you can try and make that game plan happen. But yeah, it's got a solid Mew matchup, I think. I think its Arceus is way less solid from my experience, especially because there's E-switches going into Arc decks now as well. If I was playing a Melanie Water build, that's going to be playing 7 Water 3 double turbo. Yeah, Ian's list played double E-switch, which is just really, really bad for Whims. They're basically guaranteed to get charging or Novering into you. So I think that's an issue. And Mew, we've just said, because of Beedrill to an extent, but also because Whimsicott is a known quantity, they're going to be playing basic energy, so they can just race you, basically. So I think it's just kind of a hopeful deck. It kind of wanders into most matchups being hey, this is a matchup I could win, but you need good variance in pretty much every matchup to do well.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. What do I want to take a look at? I think Urshi. Is... We've not talked about Urshi for a while. We've put it at the bottom of tier 1. Urshi's such a difficult deck to analyze, because in the hands of someone just picking it up, it's fairly uninviting. It's difficult. There's a lot going on with it. But it's evident to basically everyone in this game that if you are remotely competent with the deck, you can basically take it all the way to top 8 very consistently. Which is, in my opinion, enough to give it that tier 1 status. I think you have to be a bit of a Urshi stan at this point to feel like you can take it to a tournament and go deep with it. But if you're willing, I think it's one of those where I think if you're willing to put the time in, we've seen that it is unbelievably beneficial for people that just start with it and stick with it and really, really grind it out. It feels similar to the One Prize deck that we talked about earlier on, where you're trying to do a lot and you're trying to counter a lot, but admittedly you have more 2 prizes than maybe that deck did, but it feels like you really are in control of the game because of how much you get to use the Intellion engine to really build up different combos here and there. I think I'd be hard pressed to just, if you were looking for a deck to play, I would basically ignore this from tier 1 if you hadn't really touched it before. But I think for people that have put the reps in with it, it's easily a tier 1 deck. It's crazy some of the stuff you can do, and it's crazy some of the holes you can dig yourself out of with the Intellion engine, and with a plethora of one-offs that all serve their own specific purpose here and there. Just like it, admittedly the results weren't necessarily there from the American regionals. It really feels like it's a deck that a lot more people play in EU for sure, for whatever reason. But looking at it winning Liverpool after being a completely unknown quantity into then 3 top 8s at EUIC is just like, that alone to me shows how strong the deck is, but also how difficult the deck is because that hasn't really converted anywhere. You know the people that were top 8ing with it, you know they were super high class players that will have just been sat grinding this and testing this and talking about this. We know how Limitless functions, and we know how that group of people will have got to the list that Robin won with in the first place. It will have been putting blood, sweat and tears into working out exactly what the deck is capable of. And I think what they've produced and what it has developed from that honestly is an absolute monster, but only if you can use it properly. But I think if you can use it properly, there's no reason you can't go pretty deep into a tournament right now. And the other thing we were talking about before stream is basically, if nothing else, the presence of the deck has completely warped the meta. Everyone has to think about Mana Fee. Every single Arceus deck has to think about Dunsparce, even more so than they did with Zapdos, because it's just like it's attacking from so many different angles. Every deck now has to think about, can I be like Avery plus Rapid Flowed, which completely like cripples my board. And even if none of those things ever happen, you are hard pressed to not at least play around them and think about them when building a deck, because all 3 of those things, especially against something like an Arc Intel, there's so many different ways that can be absolutely crippling to you. So even if the deck isn't as strong, its presence on the meta is basically warped absolutely everything, which is, in my mind, just shows signs of something that is completely cracked. So yeah, I think it's definitely not a pick up and play. It's not an out of the box I'm going to do well with, but Urshi stands rise up, because there's nothing wrong with the deck at all. It's crazy.
I actually think it's a good thing that it didn't continue the wave after EUIC for players who want to play the deck, because now people will be trying to make that cheeky cut here or there. And I think not enough people have tested against competent Urshis. It's really good. Like, although people are picking up little tricks here and there about like big charming their little dudes, stuff like that, and obviously there are more techs, like you said, and people know to play the Rod or the Clara or whatever for their little 1 prizes. But I still think there's more in the playbook of Urshi that it's not going to be like a big issue for the deck. Are there any like specific cards that you think are like super important? Like, I think Tord still plays Hooper, as well as like he added Big Molt, I think, for Bilbao. He's stuck with Octillery. Like, what do you think? I think Octillery, I wouldn't have played it straight after EU because of Avery everywhere, but I think there's less Avery again, so Octillery is kind of like back in my good books.
Yeah, it's really interesting because obviously the deck that we played for UIC kind of stemmed from Robin's list. So all of the natural cuts that we made would still probably be the first cuts I would make from the Urshi deck, which, like you say, are things like the Octillery, and some of the cards that I didn't play at UIC that I wanted are things like the Big Malt and stuff like that. So It feels like those decks are kind of hand in hand. I really like Big Malt just as a turn 2 tempo. Like, the deck doesn't have no turn 2 tempo, but in early builds, just having Hooper as turn 2 tempo basically wasn't tempo against some of these decks. But actually, being a deck that isn't completely passive and can threaten bad starts on your own, or on its own, like, it feels like Robin's list really, it didn't matter if you started badly, because Robin's list was never putting you in a position where they were keeping you on a clock. They were keeping you on a clock in a different way, in that they were building a Moltres combo for the late game, but you knew you could get it into. You knew you had time to get into the game to get to that point. Whereas then, when they added the Big Mole, it felt like, oh, all of a sudden I'm like 2 turns away because I'm just getting hit for 190 every turn, sometimes 220, I guess, and potentially supplementary damage from Zigzagoons and maybe even Intellion and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, the deck could have a different approach where it was actually able to keep pace with things. Admittedly, sometimes you would it would be pretty detrimental because they would get back into the game off the back of being able to take 2 prizes on that Big Mole. But I really liked the texture of the deck then actually being an aggressor to some extent, because that made the deck really scary, to be honest, because it was an aggressor, but even when you were dealing with the aggressive factor, you were still thinking in the back of my head, right, that's now another 100 damage from Moltres that I'm going to have to deal with in like 2 or 3 turns time, which is, again, pretty scary. I still liked the whole concept that we had behind the like having to take the early prize against Hooper with Hooper. I think the really interesting thing is you kind of made note of the fact that people are understanding certain plays against the deck here and there, and I think in a lot of instances, especially against Robin, a lot of people will have kind of seen what Robin was trying to do and gone Meloetta or Lucario when they were playing Mute early game, not knowing that probably lost them the game because they were going to get Yoga looped later on and just lose. So I think that knowledge is a bit scary, but also the deck has moved away from like the Persimmon Telescopic Sight package, which I think is correct, because that felt like it feels like that's not allowed, not allowed, but not anywhere near as good anymore. Again, just naturally more people respecting Urshi a bit more and having more Manapees and stuff in the deck also lends itself to not playing that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think there's a lot of room for freedom with the deck. Obviously, we've seen plenty of one-offs works here and there, but I still think having options like Hooper and Moltres early are important for just being able to still win a game, not off of the back of this fancy combo you're building, just winning a game normally by taking 6 prizes before your opponent does. I think that's really important for the deck. I don't know for sure how useful Moltres is against things like Mew, because, again, typically, it actually really opens up the dynamic, because, again, if you haven't played against like competent Urshi players, it's really difficult to know whether to go Mew VMAX or Meloetta first, because both are right in different instances, especially now that Moltres V is a known quantity sometimes in the deck. It actually really makes it difficult, because you open yourself, like, sometimes I feel like sometimes the optimal play is Meloetta, no or Lucario, just to let them take the prize so they can't Yoga Loop you, but they essentially don't help their prize map too much, because you can still, if you're playing, I guess, theoretically 3 1-prize options, you can still kind of race them in the mid-game. But yeah, having Moltres as a Big Malt as an option now, I think really makes it difficult for a Mew player to know exactly what to do. And I think that was one of the scariest things about Urshi. I remember Robin saying they had a game plan against Mew, but they didn't want to play against Mew. It was a deck that kept them honest, and I think the way the deck has progressed, I think they keep Mew a lot more honest now, because there's just so many avenues, and because the list is such that there's so many different one-offs, you really have to kind of play around everything game one and just hope that you have a good enough hand to do that, and if not, you hope they're not playing the one answer that you're not playing around or whatever. And it feels like there's no read on what they're playing at the moment. Urshi lists are so similar, but yet the nuances are so different. It's very difficult to deal with. So I think, I don't know. I think the deck is just really strong, but you have to be experienced with it.
No doubt. Let's talk about Ice Rider, because I think there's been some hype in the chat for it. So let's talk about just the straight ice, I guess. We're going to plunk this into tier 1.5. It feels like it's similar to the Arc Intel in that you have that fragile Mew matchup where you are leaning into Path, Marnie, Prey that little bit, which is kind of the biggest drawback for the deck, because if you start disrespecting Mew, it's obviously just going to come back and win a tournament. It's just that good, obviously, and if the tides tip towards beating Arceus too far, that's when Mew's going to have a field day. But that's what Ice Rider is targeting. You're trying to target the Arc decks, and obviously you don't care about Beedrill at all. The Moltres package is scary, but you are going to play at least probably 2 Marnie, I would say, and you can try and Rider the High King your way through if they're feeding 1 prizes the entire game, and you obviously beat stick through their V-Stars quite happily. You can try and make an awkward prize map if you only make 1 Ice Rider and then still force 1 prizes out by you can do your own Raihan attack with Intel thing. So that can be good against, again, 1 prize board states, try and take out Sobble in a turn, that sort of thing. So there's some spice you can do with the deck. But I think it's more or less trying to be an Arc Punisher. Also, obviously, detonates Whimsicott as well. It's not even close. So you're good into a majority, a good amount of tier 1 decks. And I think the scales are getting to that point where you're likely to hit as many, if not more, arcs in day 1 than you will of Mew. So that bodes well for Ice Rider. So I think you're pretty likely to have a very positive record with Ice Rider. I don't know if it has the consistency to push higher up that tier list. And the Mew is still dicey. So that's what's sort of keeping it at bay right now. But I think this is probably the best window for the deck to actually start performing well, because Arc is becoming that most popular deck in the room now.
Yeah, for sure. Let's chat about Sylveon. I think is the only other kind of countery style deck that we haven't chatted about yet. Yeah, comparing it to again, in my mind, it's a difficult sell, Sylveon, because it feels like it's trying to do similar to something like the Ian Robb deck or the winning deck from the Brazilian regions this past a couple of weekends ago. It feels like it's trying to do something similar, but inherently is a bit less consistent. Sylveon, I haven't played too much with, but I know just from experience from listening to Joe playing it at the weekend, some of the hands are absolute pile with it. It's crazy. The situations that you have to get yourself out of, but it's a deck that plays so in the moment. You can actually get yourself out of those situations, because it's basically just trying to keep up with whatever your opponent is doing and that kind of thing, which is an interesting concept. I think it does it worse than both of the Arceus counter decks, but the big selling point, I think, or one of the biggest selling points at least, was it feels like it pretty much dumpsters Urshi as long as you're able to get your Sylveons into play. And it feels like it's very good at dealing with a lot of fringe stuff, because, again, VMAXs have basically gone almost there's basically no VMAXs in the meta right now other than Mew here and there. And others here and there, sorry. And it feels like just having some chunky 3 prizes is still a bit of an issue for certain decks out there. Moltres is fantastic at the moment, but at the end of the day, it's still way better at dealing with 2 prizes than 3 prizes, so it's not caught in the crossfire of all of these Moltres packages being added in. But the deck's consistency still is a massive headache for me, which is why I think it's the worst of the countery style decks. But yeah, the concept between those 3 decks I feel is pretty much identical. I just think this one pulls it off in the least consistent way possible, because you're not able to Starbirth anywhere near as consistently. Sometimes not even at all if you've decided not to invest into it early, and that's super scary for me.
I actually think it has a really consistent Starbirth turn 2. I think it's just like it makes its best board possible for turns 2 and 3, and then like you're relying on a Karina's Focus for like 3 cards, like in your mid game. So like if your early game board didn't win you the game on the spot, you just lose the game, just like flat out. You really are like putting so much emphasis on turns 2 and 3 of the game that if that, like, you either ride that wave and destroy someone, or like you just don't. That's really what it felt like to me. But I think because of Dream Gift, and yes, it's a meme that it only plays 3 VIP passes, but just hitting one of them and you play Bat, right? So you have that decent dig towards turn 1 Sylveon and Arc, and if you just get 1 VIP, it gives you that. So then you do get Birthing, and you have some crazy turns. But Urshifu's effectiveness is way less. Like let's be honest, the EUIC list just landed in the perfect tournament, right? It was the perfect cocktail of like not enough Urshifu respect, but the Sylveon was respecting Urshifu because it was purple, and like it was still getting its own benefit from rapid flowing every other matchup. So like it just had the perfect cocktail to do like quite well. And now Urshifu's effectiveness in the Sylveon deck is just like far less, and I think that was one of the main driving factors of why it was doing so well into Arceus players at the time, and that's just not a presence anymore. Let's talk about the Bediff, Mally, Rapid Mally.
Sorry,
my favorite deck.
Intellion, my bad.
We're popping this in 1.5. Really, it's actually benefiting from the Arceus confusion that we're suffering from right now. The fact that there's like 10 different valid Arc decks is good news for Mally, because it means they're not all playing like the things that you're scared about. And I think Avery has sort of fallen off that little bit as well, which is good for you. I think at EUIC, Avery was like top tech. Lots of people were playing it. Now I would expect like Pure Water Arc to probably be playing it, and that's it. Maybe Dark Arc plays one. Like probably those play it. But other than that, like maybe Duraludon plays it, but that's so fringe. You don't really have to worry about it. So that's really good for Mally. You are concerned about, obviously, Water being teched into the Dark deck, the Grass deck, and Pure Water Arc just playing it. So you do have to play around quick shooting, plus Aqua Bullet plays and Ziggy net shenanigans everywhere. The biggest fear factor, I think, for Mally right now is that Ian added the Yoga Loop into Arceus. So you actually have to play like a real pansy into Arceus now, where a lot of the time you need to have that third Inkay down on your board space, which does actually limit your push potential quite a lot. So I'm fairly content going into most Arceus matchups. I'd be literally buzzing to see Beedrill, because that would be one of the freest ones possible for you. I think the only way Isaiah did like well in one of his games was he was able to do like a triple Zig net play and Aqua Bullet that turn, and it was like great news. But I think you have to play cautiously as the Mally and have that third Inkay spot down as much as possible, evolve into Mally as much as possible. So you're like extending your hand as far as you can, but spending your damage to proactively evolve your Mallies to not get wrecked by these little ping percentages. So I think it's still got a very good Mew. Personally, I think that's just the case, and I think you're reasonable into these Arceuses because they're like committing their tech spaces to Dunsparce, Manaphy, and like things like Mustard Beedrill, which is great news for Mally. And you also have a free Whims, which is really good for me personally because I hate losing to Whimsicott, so that's nice. You are very scared about Urshifu though, which is quite bad for being in Europe. So I'm in the wrong continent right now. But yeah, I think it's great. And the best news is you don't actually need to tech any new cards. You can play my exact Liverpool 60 if you want to. I know you can have some peace of mind playing Manaphy if you really want as well, which is fine, by the way. You can play Manaphy Quick Ball if you want. I know Azul's been representing double rope recently, and I'm not like against it. I think it's pretty good into Arc, so I think that's all some solid stuff there.
Suicune Ludicolo, a deck that we initially rated really high pre-Astral, not pre-Astral, pre-Brilliant Stars, and early early on, it was a pretty nice pick. It came second in in the first American regional, and honestly, I think the deck was really, really solid. I think now the deck's in a bit more of an awkward spot. It was really solid in a time where Mew was by far, like, head and shoulders the deck you were going to play most during day one, because I think it had at least if you'd had just 10 or 15 games against a fairly decent Mew board, it was fairly easy to see what you needed to do. It was really good at trading up. It was really good at being a one prize deck until you traded up, which bought you time against Mew, which was really good. Now there's a lot of Arceus around, and you have to put basically the same amount of resources in that you did to kill Mew, to kill Arceuses, but you only get 2 prizes, and they trade back with you pretty quickly. And then they also have 1 prize options for you to deal with your turns on, the turns that you are attacking with. Obviously, you still have things like Intellion and stuff to attack mid game, but again against some of these Arceus builds, especially ones that have a heavier healing. Have heavier healing options. Intellion definitely feels a lot weaker. So yeah, I think the existence of Arceus is one of the scariest things for me, as well as just again for a while there was a time where it was pretty sad having to play and bench a Manaphy when basically you just want as many board spaces as possible to be Sobbles and Lotads, just to constantly be threatening stuff. It didn't matter if you didn't have Suicunes, because you could spawn a Suicune out of nowhere and take 3 prizes and then convert yourself back to being a 1 prize deck. But now sometimes having to play Manaphy here and there can be a bit awkward. Though, again, you still get massive benefits from the 1 prize in your deck in that regard. But yeah, I think it's a lot worse. But we've seen from Palkia how close it is to being able to keep toe-to-toe with Arceus. So it feels like it's very close. But it's so many resources having to Ludicolo just for 2 prizes. Just that 1 prize difference is actually massive, especially when it's only for 30 damage difference. Sometimes not even. Sometimes you're still having to do the same amount of damage as you are to a Mew, as you have to an Arceus V-Star, for way less payoff, which is unfortunate, but good times are coming, because Palkia gives you a bonus 40 and all of a sudden Arceus feels way easier to deal with. So right now, I think it's a bit of a risky call. It feels like you're kind of playing chicken with a lot of the Arceus builds. But there's a lot of the meta that I'm pretty happy to see as Suicune Ludi. And it's honestly a really fun deck. I really enjoy playing the deck. I don't know why in particular, but I have a lot of fun playing the deck. But I don't think the meta's anywhere near as solid for it now Mew has started to decline.
I think it plays really badly into all these Yoga Loop strats as well. I think that's like a big turn off, because you actually can't not leave your board full of 60 hit point mons, because you're bouncing your Lotads, you're bouncing your Sobbles all the time. Like, there's not a point in the game where you'd be like, okay, cool, everything's evolved up. They missed their spot or whatever.
Yeah. That
just like doesn't happen, which is a shame. Let's talk about, I guess we can just throw the Arc Ice Rider up together. Just a quick note on this is, but just because we haven't played enough Arc in this format to know, I think most of the tournament results point towards a straight Arc Intel being like the preferred choice of people, just for space for disruption cards, like playing higher path and stuff like that. But if you add in the Arc as well, you have Starbirth. That's literally it. You get to boss more because you Trinity Nova and power up Ice Riders that way. But part of the reason why your Arc matchups are so good with Ice Rider is that you have that turn 2 pressure on their Vs and V-Star, and that's like less easy with an Arc approach. So there's benefits and downsides. We haven't tested enough, but essentially we're saying that Ice Rider's a great Arc mirror card, so both of these could have some merit in the format.
Yeah. I'm going to leave Intellion to you, because I'm going to take Arc Mallet as the last build. I think we think Arc Mallet is one of the weaker Arc builds, just because, again, it feels like you're reliant on the whole Marnie path strat. Admittedly, you get to pick out your favourite card from their hand and get rid of it as well, which is really good, because it makes Marnie pathing way stronger. But I think it's a deck that, one, doesn't get to play the Intellion engine. It's naturally a barrel deck, which I think throughout the video we've said feels way worse in general when you're playing Arceus. it makes it less consistent. Plus two, it feels like again the thing you're targeting is becoming less and less of an issue, and there's more and more things targeting it. And it feels like there's less of a reason to play this over some of the other Arceus builds out there. I think it's one that's probably not bad to get reps in with, because I think Mallet is actually a very strong card going forward. I think it's on the cusp now, but it just feels like there's less and less reason to be playing this over some of the. It doesn't do any of the things it tries to do, like disruption or being like big and tanky and stuff like that. It doesn't do any of the. It tries to do all of them, but it does all of them a little bit worse than another Arceus deck out there. And while sometimes it's good to be able to have all of these different textures to the deck and trying to do all of this different stuff, I personally think honing in on one of those things and going with the Arceus deck that does whichever of those the best is going to be more beneficial. So yeah, I still think like there will be games where you absolutely cheese people. Like I've sat across from Arc Mallet before, and sometimes you can just do absolutely nothing. Like you can't even play the game, and that's where it definitely gains its percentage points. But right now it feels like there's a lot less reason to play it compared to some of the Arc builds around.
I think so, yeah. And we're going to round it off with an interesting one. Intel. We're going to put this towards the top of tier 2, I think, because it's got really interesting meta placement. I think one thing we've realized over and over again is that Arc can tech for its sort of bad matchups, be it with like the Manaphy's, the Dunsparce to remove weakness, that sort of thing. It has healing on its own. So really the only way you can beat an Arc, I think, is just by out-resourcing. And that's going to be done best with an Intel deck, where it's basically just playing more Cheryls than they have of Sharons. You have to play more than 2 Sharon and a Palpad. I think that's like the highest end I think you'll see. But I think an Intel can quite easily play like 3 Cheryl and Pad, or 4 Cheryl even, just so you hit it off Marnies the whole game. But I think you can punish an Arceus very slowly by doing this game plan. You have to be a little bit concerned about Whims, but that means you can play Water Energy and Melanie to actually like get your way through that matchup. The good news is their damage output is shoddy, especially once they've spent their V-Star power. It's normally like the second Intel that will get you over the line, because you can Melanie attach and hit them twice before they are able to, before you have to Cheryl. So that's big. So you really slow roller Whims, which I think is kind of funny. You have to fit in space for like basic energies, which is a little bit awkward. The upside of playing basic energy is that you get to also do cool quick shooting pingy shenanigans to also hurt other Sobble engines against people. So it's not like only good for Whims, it also actually makes use of Double Gunner, which I think is kind of spicy. I think you're fragile into Mew. That's like one of the issues I think with the deck. You're probably path hoping, but you're not really like a big Marnie deck. You'll try and like weave it in once or twice, but you really want to hold a hand and accumulate resources with your Intels and your Artilleries. So I think that's one of the things I need to work out that little bit more. But you can play Choice Belt, right? So you can at least try and two-shot the Mews and make life awkward for them there. Almost similar to how like a Jolteon tries to play into Mew, I guess you could say, similar to that. So I think you have a very solid Arceus in most instances. Figuring out that Mew is kind of rough, and the Whimsicott is also like good in theory, but I don't know how well it all comes together, because you're gonna have to play like probably 2 Melanie and be padding back the Melanies, because you're still worried about hammers going their way and stuff like that. So that's a one for me to figure out that little bit. But I think there's a lot of potential behind out healing an Arceus being the best way to slow roll them. It probably means you have like a 40-minute best of 1 against them, but that's like completely fine if you really want. Sort of the best news I think about this is similar to why Urshifu's so good and why Rapid Mallet is so good, is that you lean into keep calling, and it's like busted keep calling, right? Where it's getting you your Remoraid down or double Intel down as well. So you can steal some space and just play like a 2-2 or 3-3 line of the Intel. There's nothing stopping you playing like a 1-1 Urshi as well in this list, which I think is kind of cool. So I do know that Tord's been going wild with this deck. He's playing like 35 one-offs in his list as well, which is basically an Intel Ursh combo deck.
Well, I'm going to say, his is way more like their current Urshifu build just with an Intellion added in and a small Intellion package, whereas the deck that we've been talking about more so is a way heavier focus on Intellion to target Arceus, and then
I think the reason so the target Arceus is basically just playing more heal cards, but you could easily do that by playing like a 2/2 Intel and just have like enough water energy to like right hand attack with 1 prizes as well. So you can do stuff like that. I think there's just like a lot to explore with the deck, because I think this is one of the only ways you can target an Arceus, because weakness doesn't do it effectively enough. Lucario V-Star probably, well, in my book, doesn't do it effectively enough. Urshifu like kind of does, but not all the time, especially against Hooper V. I think it's more awkward now than ever. So I think just like being even more boring than them Sharon bouncing is by you Cheryl bouncing.
Yeah.
And there's not much they can do against that strat currently with the list that we know about.
So yeah, that's where we're at. I feel like naturally, because we're coming to the end of the format, I don't think there's going to be too much deviation from this. Obviously, for example, in the last format, we had like the Fetch deck come out of the woodwork right at the end of the format, so you could see something spicy, especially given that there's at least like 3 weekends worth of tournaments, where I think there's like 6 or 7 regional level tournaments over the next 3 weeks. So there's definitely still opportunity. People are definitely still looking to be creative, so there could be something that we haven't even considered yet, but I think we're pretty much there in terms of where things have settled. We will be doing something similar for Astral Radiance in the next couple of weeks once we've done a bit more testing and then been able to hop onto PCGO and just really grind out some games. But yeah, I think this is a pretty solid tier list. I feel like we've managed to nail it.
So we're both obviously commentating Lille.
Yeah.
What would you... So right now, what are you most comfortable playing? And also, of this list, what would you be like putting time into after what we've chatted about today?
So if I were playing Lille, I would constantly have Mew in the back pocket. I think a lot of people, not just myself, but I think people will have done enough reps with Mew to be able to not even need to test it too much pre-tournaments anymore. So I think having Mew as a backup pick is pretty safe almost always. Really interesting. I still think Rapid Mallet is in a great spot, but I think over the Arceus builds, Arkintel Bees is definitely one that is really interesting to me, but I think was way more successful in the US than it will be in Europe, just because of the different shift or the different natural landscape of the meta between the two regions. So I think I'd probably look more towards something like an Ian Robb list. That would be what I would be putting time into if I was trying to invest into something else. And also just the Intellion deck we've talked about, just because it sounds pretty cool. But yeah, those are kind of on my radar, but Mew in the back pocket just in case I want a pick up and play.
Yeah, sounds good. Mine would be... So obviously Rapid Mallet is like my safe pick right now. I still like... I know this is online and it's like not really saying much, but it still does so well for me, like way better than any deck, like by far, whenever I play it. So I still just like know it well enough. But yeah, I think the Intel thing would be the thing to look at the most, and Ice Rider to an extent. Ice Rider is much more of a I won't win the event, but I'll like if I hit enough arcs, I can just go super deep. And at the very least, you'll end up on like a pretty positive record. So I think that's like a pretty good points choice. Intellion feels like you could end up having by far the best deck in the room if you just get that concoction right. But it feels like you need to be... You probably had to have already been in the lab for a week.
Yeah.
And just still be there.
For sure.
Or at least watched enough of Tord to see where his mind's at with it all.
Yeah. One last question for you before we wrap up the video. Mew went into this format as being head and shoulders best deck, won the first tournament, has definitely had results since, but hasn't won another tournament since. Will we see another Mew win before the end of Brilliant Stars?
I don't think we will, but I still think it could easily be smuttering top 8s.
Yeah, for sure.
I think like just on law of averages, you get your comeuppance at some point in one of these like knockout style games, like whether it's at the top 52 hurdle, the top 16 hurdle, the top 8 hurdle, there'll be a point where you just get those duff hands and things just go wrong.
Agreed.
And we know enough decks have game plans
Yeah,
that I don't think it will win an event, but I think it's still going to be like very good point earner.
Yeah,
no
for
doubt.
Sure. I agree entirely. I think we've seen exactly how Mew does in day 2 scenarios off the past few events, where it's a lot of the time one of the most popular decks going into day 2, if not the most popular deck. But it's then like 20% of the bottom tables is Mew, just because by then you are just hitting round after round. I'm beating Mew. I'm beating Mew. I'm beating Mew. So yeah, I agree. I think we'll still struggle to see a tournament without at least one Mew in every top 8. But I think you need to run even hotter than usual now to be able to win it with Mew. But as you said, still I would say probably one of the safest points decks, because even all of these decks that try to counter you, you can play the game. Basically, like it feels like Path has basically not disappeared, but that's
it's like
definitely
2 main matchups now. That's it.
Yeah.
That's so good for you.
And basically, like in my mind, one of the only ways that people ever found of dealing with Mew is not letting them play the game. So now Mew gets to play the game again. It's honestly pretty scary in terms of just going deep into the tournament, in terms of converting to day 2.
You're actually way more in control of your destiny now as Mew, and that's like the main thing that put me off playing it in Liverpool, where like I'm just getting railroaded by lol Path, and I think that's just like, I'm so happy people have deviated from that. Like at the start of the format, all of our testing, I was like, that's not a strong enough win condition. Don't do this, everyone. And none of our lists really were going down that avenue. And finally, people are like, let's actually try and win in other ways that lets us win, rather than just says cross your
Stops
fingers.
them
like,
from winning.
I'm
Yeah,
so glad that that's like finally where
the amount
mentality has shifted.
The amount of control Baby Malt gives you against Mew is so much better than just trying to cheese your way into the game with Path. Like, it's crazy. It's really nice seeing that. It's kind of sad that we have a card such as Path that immediately like hits a deck like a dump truck, just because everyone thinks it's the answer, because it just made playing Mew so miserable for about a month, because every single game was either a mirror or someone pathing you and be like you just looking at your hand and going, well,
here we go.
Do I have it? But now like I don't mind losing to a Moltres combo, because it feels like they've worked for it, whereas
also the Mew, like you're the one in control. You've made this prize race.
Yeah. You've done
as much setup as the opponent has.
And there's definitely way more things you can do to deal with a Moltres combo. You can play Marnie, it hurts your deck, but that's the point of attack. You can play third one prizer, it hurts your turn 1 outs, arguably, depending on what one prizer it is. But that's the point of attack.
Sliding turn 1? You're joking.
But yeah, interesting. That was my one question for you. Do we think we'll see another Mew win? I might tweet that.
It's weird that I just said that I don't think it'll win again, but I feel way happier playing it now than I would at Liverpool, when I would have said it probably is like the deck tip to win. That's so weird to think about it that way round. But I'm just like, I'd actually be happy to play Mew now, knowing that I don't win the event.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
That's so wild.
We're in a meta where it's actually it feels like it's really it feels like it's very difficult to pinpoint a deck to win an event. Sometimes you can just see it. You can be like, okay, again, law of averages, that deck wins the event. But it feels like we're in, like, even saying Arceus is kind of very broad. But it feels like there's so much competing near the top that it's very difficult to even pinpoint a deck you would peg to win the event these days. It's interesting. But yeah,
I mean, and there's so many fine margins with all these arc mirrors. I know we're like rating them higher and lower, but a lot of the time the list doesn't matter as much as like opening hands and coin flips and stuff.
Yeah.
It's sad to say, but it just like any build of Arceus can trump the other just based on like openers. So
sweet. Well, that wraps things up. Thanks so much for watching. If you were watching on YouTube, and we'll be doing another Astral. Well, we're doing a tier list for Astral in the next couple of weeks. So. Make sure you keep an eye out. Cheers for watching, everyone, and yeah.